Okay, let's talk a little bit more about shifts in the demand curve. Because the market has such great demand and supply is driven by the demand, if the demand curve holds all other things constant, it must stay stable for about long periods of time. For an economist to be able to make predictions or make assumptions, they must be able to use the current data they have and predict an economic futuristic value that will allow you to make assumptions of where you're heading, so that the economists will have value. If any of these factors change, the demand curve will shift. An increase in the demand curve is represented by a shift in the demand curve to the right. A decrease in the demand curve is represented by a shift of the demand curve to the left. Income and employment and well-being and outlook has a large relationship into how the markets will go and how demand will be carried out and supply will be followed through. The relationship between income and quantity demanded depends on what type of the good the product is. You remember we talked earlier about normal goods and inferior goods. A normal good is a good for which an increase in income leads to an increase in demand. So the better things are, the better we're going with the normal goods. That we're more willing to spend money on normal goods if our income and employment status and our outlook is positive. We will spend more money on normal goods. An inferior good is which when an increase in income leads to a decrease in demand. So an inferior good is something that is not as well sought after, but that you might take a lesser quality of a product to save price. So we also talked about substitutes and complements. Substitutes are where two goods for which an increase in the price of one good leads to an increase in the demand for the other good. Remember we talked about if Coke raises their prices, there's more of a demand for Pepsi. Complements are two goods in which an increase of the price of one good leads to the decrease in the demand of the other good. We talked about hot dog buns and hot dogs. If the price of hot dogs goes to the roof, then the demand for hot dog buns will go down because there will not be as much demand because people stop buying hot dogs, therefore they won't need hot dog buns. So, we talked about demand pretty much in detail. Demand and its relationship and how the curve shifts will be on your test. May show you some graphs and ask you to describe the graph or ask you to explain, was it a shift to the left, a shift to the right, and why it shifted to the left and to the right. So demand, you should have a pretty good feel about that. If you read the book, read the PowerPoints, and you watch the lecture, hopefully you'll feel pretty good about demand. If we talk about supply and the supply curve and the relationship of the supply curve to price and quantity supplied. Remember, we talked about the quantity supplied, which is the amount of good that sellers are willing and able to sell for the product so that they can make their money. The quantity supplied is positively related to the price. This implies that the supply curve will be upward sloping. Remember we talked about the law of demand and law of supply. The law of supply is the claim that with all other things equal, that the quantity supplied of a good rises when the price of the good rises. If we talk about the supply schedule, remember we talked about the demand schedule, now we talk about the supply schedule. The supply schedule is a table that shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied. So when we talk about the supply curve, if you look at the graph of the ice cream and the price points on the ice cream, a graph of the relationship between the price of a good and the price supplied. Next we'll talk about individual supply versus market supply. The market supply can be found by summing individual supply curves. Individual supply curves are summed horizontally at every price. The market supply curve shows how the total quantity supplied varies at the price of the good as the good varies. Shifts in the supply curve happen because the market supply holds other things constant, and the supply curve will shift if the factors change. An increase in the supply is represented by a supply curve shift to the right. A decrease in supply is represented by a supply curve shift to the left. Several things can play a factor into this. Technology, employment, income, a lot of things can play into the supply curve shifting to the right or to the left. Okay, so far we've talked about expectations, we've talked about sellers, we've talked about buyers, we've talked about complements and substitutes. So now let's talk about what happens when demand and supply come together. Because that's what every market is driven by supply and demand. When they come together and they match up perfectly, and what we're always looking for is equilibrium. I mentioned that earlier, but we're going to talk a little more detail about it now. Equilibrium is the point where the supply and demand curves intersect on your graphs, and the market price is called equilibrium. It's a situation in which the market price has reached the level at which the quantity supplied also meets the quantity demanded. So if we're making donuts in the morning, we make enough because we know by the end of 5 o'clock that we've sold exactly how many we made. We know the price, we know the price point that people are willing to pay. The equilibrium price is often called market clearing price because both buyers and sellers are satisfied with the price. If you look on your graphs and your diagrams, you'll see the equilibrium price factored out there. We'll go into in later chapters, we'll talk a little bit more about the mathematics of figuring the equilibrium price. When we talk about equilibrium quantity, we talk about the quantity supplied at the quantity demanded at the equilibrium price. If the actual market price is higher than the equilibrium price, there will be a surplus of goods. When we talk about a surplus of goods, that means that goods are left over that have been produced but are not selling at the price we need them to sell at. A surplus is a situation where the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, generally pushing the price down because people decide to move the quantity. To eliminate surplus, producers will lower the price until the market reaches equilibrium. If the actual price is lower than the equilibrium price, there will be a shortage. A shortage is a situation where quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. Sellers will respond to a shortage by raising the price of the good until the market reaches equilibrium. So we also talked about the law of supply and the law of demand. Both, when you put them together, are the claim that the price of any good adjusts to bring the supply and demand for that good into balance. 3 steps in doing this, 3 steps in analyzing the changes in equilibrium. First, we must decide whether the event shifts to the supply or to demand, or the curve is moving inward or outwards, or both. Next, we need to determine the direction in which the curve is shifting. And then we also need to use the supply and demand diagram to see how the shift changes in equilibrium price have changed to the amount of quantity being supplied. A shift in the demand curve is called a change in the demand. A shift in the supply curve is called a change in supply. A movement along these lines in the fixed demand curve is called a change in the quantity demanded. A movement along a fixed supply curve is also called a change in the quantity supplied. So when an event shifts the supply or demand curve, we can examine the effects on the equilibrium price and the quantity. We can look at the original equilibrium price, and we can look at the current equilibrium price, and we can tell whether we're supplying is shifting outward or shifting inwards. The model of supply and demand is a powerful tool for anyone analyzing the markets. Supply and demand together determine the price of the economy's goods and services. These prices serve as a signal that the guide that the allocations of scarce resources are being used appropriately in the economy. And prices determine who produces each good and how much of each good is produced. Supply and demand are the 2 main buzzwords for economics. Hopefully you have read your chapters, you've looked at the PowerPoint presentation, and you have a good feel on supply and demand. But as always, please feel free to email me or text me if you have any questions. For the most part, everything from this chapter that will be on your first test will be vocabulary, making sure that you understand the concepts and the terms. So please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Thank you.